Everyone, welcome back to my channel for a brand new mystery with Molly. If you are new around here, if you've never seen my face on your screen before, then hi, my name is Molly and I post true crime videos like this every single week. So if you think that that is something that you might want to stick around for, then please do subscribe and don't forget to switch on the little notification bell so that YouTube will let you know whenever I post a new video. This week we're going to be talking about a solved case from the southeast of England. In the late 1960s, 3 brutal murders occurred which just completely shook the little village in Berkshire where they took place. A village which was previously thought to be a very safe area, but not anymore. Now there was a sadistic killer prowling the streets and the police had the task of trying to uncover their identity. Pretty quickly they were able to find evidence which put a dangerous sexual predator behind bars for 2 of the killings, whilst the other remained unsolved, and the mystery surrounding this crime wouldn't be uncovered until more than 4.5 decades later. This week's case is about the horrific Beenham murders. But quickly before we get into the case, I would just like to say a big thank you to June's Journey for very kindly sponsoring this section of the video. June's Journey is a hidden object mystery game set in the gorgeous glamour of the 1920s with a diverse cast of characters, and it's a game where you get to play detective. You play as June Parker, a woman who is trying to solve the mystery of who murdered her sister, and along the way you'll also be uncovering the many secrets within June's family. As you progress through the game, you'll collect different clues which will slowly help you to piece the case together. Each clue will bring you one step closer to solving the mystery, and as well as this, you can also start fixing up and renovating the Parker family's very old and run-down mansion and the garden surrounding it, which I can't lie is probably one of my favourite aspects of the game. I obviously adore the mystery aspect too and I love finding the clues, but there's something about just sitting down and decorating my garden which fills me with such joy. I just find it so fun and relaxing, and the more levels of the game that you complete, the more stars you'll earn, and you can use these stars to unlock new decoration items for the mansion. June's Journey has honestly just become one of my go-to mobile games now. I was actually playing it a lot last week whilst I was away on holiday. Whilst I was just lounging about by the pool, I was also playing June's Journey on my phone because that is my idea of relaxation. But it's also a great game to play in the evenings whilst you are trying to unwind after work, or I also like to play it whilst I'm taking a quick 5-minute break from work sometimes. So if you would like to check out June's Journey for yourself, then you can download the game for free via the link down below in my description box, or alternatively you can scan the QR code that is on the screen right now. And June's Journey is available on Android and iOS mobile devices as well as on PC through Facebook Games. Once again, a huge thank you to June's Journey for sponsoring this video and supporting the channel. Thank you so much to you guys for always showing your support to the sponsors on this channel, and now let's just get into the case. But just before we continue, please listen carefully to the following. This video is about the murder of a young woman and the murders of 2 young girls, and it involves heavy themes such as violence towards children and sexual assault. Viewer discretion is advised. So for this week's case, we are going back, coming up to 57 years now, to late 1966 in Beenham, which is a village located in the county of Berkshire in the southeast of England. Now back in the 60s, Beenham was known for being a very nice little village, to be honest. It was an area where everyone knew everyone. Everyone would just be very friendly and they would say hi to their neighbours. There was a real sense of community in Beenham at this time, and it was always thought to be a very secure place to live. Crime rates were very low. Nothing bad really ever happened there. So as I touched on briefly before, it felt safe, a safe place to live, or at least that was until this case occurred. One young woman who lived in Beenham was Yolande Waddington. She was 17 years old at the time that this case took place. Unfortunately, there isn't really much information online that I could find about Yolande and her background. I couldn't find the name of her parents anywhere. I know that she had a younger brother named Giles who was about 9 years younger than her. When she was 17, he was just 8. And I also know that she was originally from a town called Newbury in Berkshire. That's where she lived with her family. Newbury is a town which is just under 10 miles away from Beenham. However, shortly before this case occurred, in fact, I think literally just a couple of days before, she decided to relocate to Beanham. She decided to move there on her own because she got herself a job there. Yolande secured a job working at a local farm. It was called Oakwood Farm, and she was going to basically be a live-in nanny for the family who owned this farm. Apparently they had a young daughter and Yolande was going to look after her. Just want to quickly pause on the case for a second and say that my neighbours are currently having some building work done. So if you can hear that occasionally in the background of this video, I'm really sorry, but I needed to film this video today, so kind of unavoidable. But anyway, so Yolande was very new to the village. She was meeting new people and she was described as being a very nice young girl, to be honest. She was friendly and sociable and chatty, but I mean, she had only moved there a few days before, so she hadn't met too many of the locals. She was just finding her feet and getting settled in, I suppose. It was probably an exciting time for her. She was entering adulthood, she'd gotten a new job, she was independent. This was a whole new chapter of her life that she was about to enter. However, it was a chapter that would barely even begin, as not long after Yolande arrived in Beanham, she actually disappeared. The date that she went missing was the 28th of October 1966, and on that Friday evening, Yolande left Oakwood Farm. I think she'd finished work for the day, and according to one source, she headed to a nearby postbox and she posted a letter which she had written to her boyfriend. I'm guessing that he probably lived back in Newbury where her family lived. And following this, after posting this letter, she went to the local pub. There was only one pub in the little village of Beanham and it was called the Six Bows. This was just after 10:30 p.m. that night, and once she arrived at the pub, she purchased a packet of cigarettes. She sat down and she smoked one, and then she left the pub and decided to walk back home, walk back to the farm. This young woman was walking home alone that night in the dark, and as it would turn out, she never made it to her destination. She never made it to the farm, and at some point along her route, Yolande Waddington seemed to just vanish. Now, of course, because she vanished, she failed to report for work the following morning, and her employers at the farm became concerned about her. According to one source, her employers did have Yolande's boyfriend's telephone number, and so they decided to give him a call to ask if he knew where Yolande was. Was she with him? However, he said no. He said that he had no clue where his girlfriend was. They waited a couple of hours just to see if she would turn up, but she never did. And so at around midday on the 29th of October, her employers picked up the phone again, but this time they called the police and reported their new nanny as missing. And it wasn't long before Yolande would be found, but sadly she wouldn't be alive. Just the day after this, on Sunday the 30th of October 1966, so this was 2 days after she disappeared, her body was discovered. She was discovered, I think, actually by her boss, the farmer, and one of his workers in a ditch, a waterlogged ditch, not far at all from where she worked from the farm. And tragically, it was quickly established that Yolande had been the victim of a brutal murder. The fact that she was found in a ditch so close to the farm indicated that she almost made it home on the night that she was killed. She was very near to the farm, very near to safety, when clearly someone attacked and killed her and just left her body in this ditch. Yolande was partially nude when she was found. Well, she was practically completely naked, apart from I think she still had her socks on, and also another piece of her clothing had been wrapped around her head and she had been gagged with another item of clothing. It had been stuffed inside of her mouth by the killer, probably in an attempt to keep her quiet and stop her from screaming for help. As for the rest of her clothing, that wasn't found alongside her body in the ditch, but it was found in another area nearby. In fact, the day before this, before Yolande's body had even been discovered, her clothing had been found. It's just that no one realised that it was Yolande's clothing at the time. One of the farm workers found some items of clothing just discarded on the ground around found some hay bales in the barn on Oakwood Farm. They found this beige jumper and also a headband, and the farm worker didn't really think anything of it at the time. Apparently back when this case occurred, this barn was known for being a location where a lot of local young couples would go to, I guess, have some alone time, and so it wasn't too unusual for clothing to be found in there. So yeah, no one really thought anything of it until the following day when Yolande's nude body was found in the ditch, and they came to the realization that this was Yolande's clothing. She had been wearing this beige jumper and this headband on the night that she went missing. As well as being gagged, Yolande had also been tied up. Her hands had been tied behind her back with baling twine so that she was restrained and she couldn't try to fight back. And it was determined that she had been strangled to death. She'd been strangled again with some twine which had been wrapped so tightly around her neck. And I think that this twine was still around her neck when her body was discovered. But although strangulation was her official cause of death, that wasn't the only injury that she had sustained. In addition to that, it was also found that Yolande had been stabbed. She had been stabbed twice with a knife in her torso area, and actually a knife was found near the crime scene, so police believed that this was the murder weapon and that the killer had ditched it after the murder. It was, I believe, a pocket knife or a pen knife, you know, one of those knives that you can fold up, although according to one source I read, apparently it was just the blade of this knife that had been found. The blade had snapped off, possibly during the attack on Yolande. Now, I couldn't actually find any information online as to whether or not Yolande had been sexually assaulted by her attacker. Perhaps the pathologist was unable to tell because, as I understand it, she was kind of semi-submerged in the water in the ditch when she was discovered, so maybe this washed away any evidence of sexual assault, or maybe she wasn't assaulted in that way by the attacker. But obviously she was found naked, so even if she hadn't been sexually assaulted, it's still very possible that the murder was sexually motivated. Soon after the discovery of Yolande's body, the police were at the scene and they began searching around the area nearby, looking for and collecting potential evidence. So for example, they obviously connected the knife that had been found, they collected Yolande's clothing, and something that they immediately noticed was that there were actually traces of blood on this clothing. There were blood stains on her beige jumper from where she had been stabbed. Traces of blood were also found on these fertilizer bags in the barn, so they were also collected as evidence, and the murder investigation officially began. Yolande's family were quickly informed of the tragic news, and the police set out to find the sadistic individual that had done this to her. And it wasn't just the local police team from Berkshire who began working on this case. Officers and detectives from London, from the Metropolitan Police Force, were assigned to assist with this investigation too. As part of their inquiries, they started conducting door-to-door inquiries, going to every house in the village and taking statements from the occupants, asking if they had seen or heard anything suspicious on the night that Yolande went missing, or if they just had any information which could have possibly been related to her case. And as well as this, the police heavily focused on the place where Yolande was last seen alive, the Six Bells pub. As we know, she disappeared after she left that pub on the evening of the 28th of October, so the police were very keen to speak to all of the people, the customers who had also been in the pub that night. And it was as a result of this line of inquiry when a potential suspect appeared to emerge in the case. You see, one of the people that the police quickly identified as having been in the Six Bells pub that night at the same time as Yolande was David Burgess. He was a young local man. I believe he was around 18, 19 when this case occurred, so he wasn't much older than Yolande, and he did not have a very good reputation, to be honest. He was known for being a troublemaker. I don't know if he had ever had any involvement with the police before, if he had a criminal history, although I did read in one article that he had apparently attacked a young girl when he was around like 12, 13 years old, and so I believe this was partly the reason why people around the village just thought of him as being a bad guy. I think he could often be quite aggressive in nature. He supposedly enjoyed making people feel, I guess, nervous and intimidated by him and around him. And he was known to carry a knife. He always had a knife on him. But the reason why he became an immediate suspect in this case was because, as I mentioned, he was in the Six Bells pub on the night that Yolande was there, the night that she was killed. Apparently he'd been there for a number of hours just drinking pint after pint, and witnesses who were also in the pub that evening informed the police that they saw David Burgess leave the pub very shortly after Yolande got up and left. But that wasn't the only suspicious thing about David Burgess, because the police also learned that following Yolande's death, the day following her death actually, he was seen with some injuries to his face. He had scratches on his face, so the police wondered where these scratches had come from. Had they perhaps come from Yolande? We know that he was seen leaving the pub shortly after her that evening, so did he follow her back towards the farm and attack her? And did he get those scratch marks during the struggle? Was Yolande scratching at his face in an attempt to fight him off? So because of all of these suspicions, David Burgess was brought in for questioning, during which he admitted that yes, he was at the Six Bells pub that night, and yes, he probably left not long after Yolande Waddington. However, he completely denied having anything to do with her murder. He said that he was innocent. And so the police asked him, well, how did you get those scratches on your face? And apparently he said something along the lines of, oh, whilst I was walking back to my house that night, I tripped and I fell into a bush with nettles. He said that he was quite drunk and he just lost his balance and fell into the bush, and that was how he got the injuries, which I don't think the police really believed at all. They were still very, very skeptical of David Burgess and his story, and suspicion towards him just increased even more when David Burgess himself actually informed a police officer that he'd owned a knife which was practically identical to the one that had been used to kill Yolande. He just offered up that information willingly to them. He said, oh yeah, I used to have a knife that was exactly like that, but he claimed that he lost it before Yolande's murder. Convenient. So yeah, as I said, the police were very, very skeptical, but of course suspicion alone isn't enough to arrest or charge someone. They had no real evidence linking him to the crime, and so they couldn't do anything. They just had to let him go. And I guess keep looking into him as a person of interest, whilst also continuing with other lines of inquiry, one of which was blood analysis. Now, as I mentioned before, when Yolande's clothing was found, traces of blood were discovered on her beige jumper, some of which it turns out wasn't Yolande's. Traces of another person's blood was found on her jumper, so instantly it was obviously theorized that this blood had come from the killer. Perhaps from where Yolande was trying to fight him off, he drew blood and this blood dripped onto the jumper. Maybe the knife slipped as he was stabbing Yolande and it cut him, who knows? But whatever had happened, the police now had traces of the perpetrator's DNA. But what were they going to do with this evidence? Because obviously this was 1966 and DNA and forensic science was just not really a thing yet. It was incredibly limited. They wouldn't be able to use this blood evidence to definitively link someone to the crime. So like they couldn't take the killer's blood and compare it to a suspect and get a definitive match like scientists are able to do today. All experts could really do back then was compare blood groups, so they could analyse the killer's blood and determine what blood group they belonged to, but they couldn't do much more than that, to be honest. And so the police came up with an idea. They decided to conduct a mass blood screening, and in fact this case is one of the first in UK criminal history where a mass blood screening was carried out, because this kind of science was very new. do? They basically wanted every single male who lived in the village of Beenham and who were between the ages of like 16 years old to 50 to 60 years old to come forward and provide a blood sample so that their blood could be compared to that of the killers. Now, again, like I said before, they weren't going to be able to definitively match any of the blood samples to the killer's DNA, but they could establish the blood groups and try to narrow down their suspect list that way. If they can compile a list of local men who all had the same blood type as the killer, then they can focus their investigation on them and hopefully catch their guy. So they put up these signs and these posters around Beenham which asked men to come along and voluntarily give their blood sample in the local village hall. This was in November of 1966, by the way, so just the month following Yolande's murder. And I think the majority, if not all men in Beenham did comply. More than 200 men gave over their blood for testing, including, actually, David Burgess, who was already one of the top suspects in the case. His blood sample was taken. However, to the police's shock, his blood group didn't appear to match that of the killers. So it appeared as though perhaps David Burgess was innocent after all. The mass blood screening ultimately identified just 4 men in the village as having the same blood group as the murderer, and so the police looked extensively into each of them as potentially being the killer. However, they were never able to find any concrete evidence which connected them to the crime, and in fact all 4 of these men actually had very solid alibis which put them nowhere near the crime scene, and so one by one they were ruled out. Despite their efforts, despite this huge operation, the mass blood screening, it appeared as though the police weren't really getting anywhere. They thought that they had a pretty solid suspect, David Burgess, but blood analysis suggested otherwise, and every other line of inquiry and person of interest also seemed to just lead to dead ends too. The police just had no idea who had killed Yolande Waddington that night, and over the coming months, her case tragically started to go cold. It remained unsolved. But then, just 6 months later, in the spring of 1967, the residents of Beenham were shocked to discover that not one but another 2 young girls had also suddenly gone missing without a trace, and people started to wonder whether Yolande's killer had struck again. It was the afternoon of the 17th of April 1967 when 2 young local girls, 2 friends, decided to go on a bike ride together. These girls were Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams. They were both 9 years old. They were best friends. They were described as being very kind and helpful little girls. They went to the same school where they had a lot of friends. They were very well liked and popular, and they were virtually inseparable. They loved spending time together. And on this particular day, the 17th of April, it was a Monday, so they'd been to school, and when school finished, as I said, they decided to go out on their bicycles, which I think is something that they did often. They would always go out and play together. Of course, you have to remember that this was a very different time. This was the 60s. So young children, for the most part, were trusted to go out on their own without their parents. Parents didn't necessarily think that there was any danger in letting their kids go out and play. However, on this particular day, Jeanette and Jacqueline never returned to their homes. They just disappeared, and it wasn't long before the alarm was raised. Apparently the girls went out on their bikes at around 4 p.m. that afternoon, and when they hadn't returned by like 6:45, the families knew that something was up. So both the girls' fathers immediately went out and they started searching along the streets for their daughters, and quickly several other people joined the search too. I think other family members and also just neighbours joined the search. The local community really came together here, and everyone just wanted to help these 2 families as much as they could. And of course the police were contacted too, so they had officers out searching for any trace of Jeanette and Jacqueline. And the police, and I think the volunteers, were all given these whistles for whilst they were searching, so if anyone was to find anything, they were to blow on their whistle to alert the others. And after a couple of hours of searching, the noise of a whistle was heard because the girls' dead bodies had been found. And what is so so heartbreaking is that Jeanette's own father, his name was Tony, he was actually the one who discovered his daughter dead. You see, as part of his search, Tony actually decided to head to this gravel pit in Beenham. It was called Blake's Pit, because he knew that this was an area where his daughter would go sometimes to play with friends. So he thought that it was worth having a look there to see if he could spot her. And when he arrived just before 8:30 p.m, one of the first things that he noticed was the girls' bicycles just discarded on the ground near the pit. The bicycles that they'd gone out on just hours before. And as he continued looking around, that was when he made the truly awful discovery. He discovered his daughter Jeanette's body. And shortly after this, at around 10:45 that night, Jeanette's friend Jacqueline was also found dead. She was found in an area only about 100 yards away from Jeanette. Sources state that Jeanette Wigmore had been stabbed to death. She had sustained 5 stab wounds to her body and her throat had been cut, whereas Jacqueline Williams was strangled and also drowned, I believe. Jacqueline was found lying face down in a water bank near the gravel pit. Sources seem to suggest that the girls were also sexually assaulted, and although they had different causes of death, the police obviously strongly believed that they had both been killed by the same person, which, as you can imagine, absolutely shook and just completely terrified the locals. Parents of young children were so frightened. As I mentioned before, this was a time when children were free to go out on their own, especially in a little village like Beenham. It was previously thought to be a very safe area, but now that Jeanette and Jacqueline had been killed, it was the opposite. There was a child killer lurking the streets, and he was probably a local man. You see, when Yolande Waddington was killed 6 months earlier, I think a lot of people in the village kind of assumed that her murderer wasn't from around here because she herself wasn't. As we know, she'd literally lived in the village for a matter of days before she was killed, so the locals just jumped to the conclusion that her murderer was someone from outside the community too. But now that Jeanette and Jacqueline had been killed just months later, I think they started to suspect that maybe that wasn't the case after all. Maybe Yolande herself was killed by a local man, and that same man took the lives of Jeanette and Jacqueline too. Perhaps these two horrific cases were connected. So the police immediately got started on their investigation into the murders of Jeanette and Jacqueline. And guess who they very quickly identified as one of their top suspects? None other than local man David Burgess. And as I understand it, one of the main reasons why he was a suspect in this case was because he actually worked in the gravel pits where Jeanette and Jacqueline were found dead. And he was working that afternoon, the afternoon that they were killed. But not just him, actually. One of his siblings, his older brother, his name was John, he also worked in the gravel pits. So I believe he also became a person of interest. But I think overall it was David who was ultimately the main suspect. I mean, how could he not be? This was a man who had already been a top suspect in the murder of another young woman just months before. So of course he was going to be looked at when it came to this case, because he was literally at the crime scene that day. So David Burgess and his brother, and I think some other men who worked at the gravel pit, were asked to come in for questioning, and they were also asked if they could please hand over their clothing, the clothing that they were wearing on the day that Jeanette and Jacqueline died. So they did, David did, and this clothing was sent off for examination, and this would ultimately provide the police with the breakthrough that they needed, because on one of David's boots, the boots that he had been wearing on the day that the girls were killed, scientists found traces of blood. And when examined further, it was found that this blood was a match to Jeanette Wigmore's blood. Well, her blood type. As we discussed, at this point in time, they couldn't definitively match DNA and blood exactly to one individual, but they could say that the blood on David's boot belonged to the same blood group as Jeanette. And apparently Jeanette's blood group was very, very rare. I believe I read that only 1.5% of the entire population had this same blood type. So the police felt very confident that it was Jeanette's blood on his boot, and therefore that was evidence to link Burgess to the crime. In addition to this evidence, apparently a statement that his brother John gave to the police also placed David very near to the location where the girls' bodies were found. John told the police that at around 6 p.m. on the 17th of April, after all of the other gravel pit workers had finished for the day and gone home, David actually said to his brother that he was going to go and check on some rabbit snares by Blake's Pit, and Blake's Pit was where Jeanette and Jacqueline would be found murdered later that night. And according to one source, the police had estimated that the girls were probably killed that evening sometime between like 5:30 and 6:45. So John's statement put his younger brother David at the scene of the crime during that time frame, during the time that the girls were murdered. And due to this evidence and the blood evidence, the police ultimately felt that they had enough to arrest and charge 20-year-old David Burgess with the murders of Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams. His trial for the killings began later that same year in the summer of 1967, and he pleaded not guilty. Despite the evidence, he claimed that he was innocent, and he also just showed a real lack of caring during the trial, to be honest. His behaviour during his court proceedings was honestly just quite bizarre. He was just kind of acting like it wasn't even happening. He was literally on trial for the murder of 2 children, and he just wasn't taking it seriously at all. It was like he was just trying to act oblivious to the whole thing, like he didn't give a crap, to be completely honest. But despite this and despite his denial, at the end of his trial, David Burgess was found guilty of double murder and he received a life sentence. Thankfully, Jeanette and Jacqueline had received justice for their brutal murders, but sadly, the same could not be said for 17-year-old Yolande Waddington. Her case still remained unsolved. The police still actually had their suspicions that David Burgess indeed was her killer too, but the evidence just wasn't there to prove it, and clearly if he was involved, he had no intention of admitting his guilt in Yolande's death anytime soon. Or at least it seemed he had no intention of making any kind of confession to the police. You see, in 1968, so just the year after he was sent to prison for life, the police learned that he had allegedly confessed to Yolande's murder whilst he was behind bars. He allegedly admitted to, I think, a prison officer and also some fellow inmates that he was the one who killed Yolande. And it was like he was almost bragging about it to them. He was bragging that he had gotten away with her murder. The prison officer who he allegedly confessed this to did get in touch with the police immediately, and David Burgess was once again interviewed by the detectives in relation to this, in relation to Yolande's death. However, just like he had done in 1966 when Yolande was killed, he denied it. He wasn't giving anything up to the police. Well, in actual fact, apparently his exact words were, quote, "You'll have to prove it." The detectives told him that they still believed that he was Yolande's killer, and he just said, "Prove it," which just shows how truly sadistic and arrogant this man was. This was all just a game for him. He was essentially enjoying tormenting the police, and it was torment for them because, again, as I mentioned, without evidence and without a confession, they could not do anything. They could not charge David Burgess with Yolande's murder. So if he was the perpetrator, it seemed as though he really was going to get away with it. Years and years went by with no justice in Yolande's case. Obviously, David Burgess still remained behind bars over these years as he was serving his sentence for the killings of Jeanette and Jacqueline. Although, unbelievably, in 1996, so this is just under 30 years after he was convicted of the murders, so by this point Burgess would have been around 50 years old, he was actually transferred to a Category D prison, an open prison. If you're unaware of what what an open prison is, it's basically a prison with a lot less security, I suppose. Offenders are basically allowed to come and go as they please for the most part. They are allowed back out into society during the day, and then they are trusted to return at night or at a certain time. They have a curfew. And by 1996, after serving just under 30 years so far, David Burgess was living in an open prison, which, to be completely honest, really angers me. I cannot believe that the authorities would allow a man who has murdered not one but two people, two children, possibly even three, to be in an open prison and just reintegrate back into society. I think it's insane. But anyway, he was in this open prison, so they obviously trusted him to be responsible and go out and return back to the prison and serve the remainder of his sentence. However, as it would turn out, this would be a huge mistake on the authorities' part because, shocker, David Burgess could not be trusted, and he actually made a run for it. He left the open prison one day in September of 1996, and he just didn't come back. He went on the run. He changed his identity. He gave himself a fake name, and unbelievably, he was able to fly under the radar and remain on the run for about a year and a half, or just under a year and a half. It wasn't until February of 1998 when he was finally captured after he attempted to commit an armed robbery. He tried to rob a bank in Hampshire in England, so he was arrested and sent back to prison, and he received an additional 10 years behind bars for this robbery attempt. Unfortunately, over the coming years, Yolande's case would remain quiet and it would remain unsolved. But then came 2010. So by this point, it had been 44 years since Yolande's murder, and the Thames Valley Major Crime Review team decided that it was time to reopen her case in the hopes that finally, after all these years, they would be able to get justice for Yolande. The police were obviously hopeful that forensic science would finally provide them with the breakthrough that they so desperately needed, because of course DNA testing had come a hell of a long way over the past 4 decades. So yeah, they wanted to see if these advancements in forensics could at last solve this mystery. So as part of this review, the police obviously wanted to get back out all of the old evidence that had been kept in storage over the years and send it off for retesting. So for example, evidence that had been collected from Yolande's crime scene and from the barn, like her clothing. Now frustratingly, Yolande's beige jumper, the jumper that had traces of both her blood on and the killer's blood, that was actually lost by 2010. It's not known what happened to it. I think it just got lost in storage at some point over the years, which was of course very disappointing for the Major Crime Review team and very worrying as well, because as I said, they knew already that the jumper did have the killer's DNA on it, but it was gone, so they weren't going to be able to retest it. But you know, that's that. The jumper is gone. They obviously can't dwell on it too much, and they just sent off the rest of the evidence that had been kept safe in storage to the lab for testing. This evidence included the headband that Yolande was wearing on the night that she was killed. A hair comb found at the scene was sent off for testing, and also, if you remember, I mentioned earlier on in the video that these fertilizer bags which had blood on were also found and collected, so these were sent off for retesting in 2010 as well. And what do you know? They had a breakthrough. Scientists were able to detect traces of DNA, of what they believed was the killer's DNA, on these fertilizer bags. They had the murderer's DNA profile. So this DNA profile was entered onto the National DNA Database, and immediately a match came back. The match was to David Burgess. Of course it was. The man who'd been pretty much the prime suspect in Yolande's murder since the very start. His DNA was on these bloody fertilizer bags which were found in the barn where items of her clothing were discovered, and not far from the ditch where her body had been left. So this was strong evidence against him. Finally, they had strong evidence against him. But was it going to be strong enough? Probably not really. I mean, it was pretty damning evidence, but if this was the only evidence that the police had, if they took Burgess to trial with just this evidence, his defense team would probably just try to explain it away by saying, well, he lived locally. He worked in the gravel pits not far from the farm where Yolande was killed. So there's every chance that at some point he could have touched that fertilizer bag, and that's why his DNA was found on it. But that doesn't necessarily prove that he was involved in her murder. It could have just been innocent DNA transfer. So it was strong evidence, but the police knew that they needed more. They needed evidence which would tie David Burgess directly to Yolande, and so they turned to the headband. Yolande's headband was sent off for further examination, and I think initially the police thought that the headband probably wouldn't produce anything significant because from what they could see, there wasn't any blood on it or anything. It was a bit grubby and there were a few stains on it, but they just looked like dirt stains, to be honest. However, luckily they were wrong. When examined further, it was actually found that these grubby stains were actually drops of blood. They just didn't look like it. So this blood was tested, and as I understand it, scientists discovered two DNA profiles on this headband, two people's DNA. One of the profiles, I imagine, was Yolande's because it was her item of clothing, and the other was a match to David Burgess. His DNA was found on Yolande's headband, and this was the concrete evidence that the police so desperately needed. This was the breakthrough because David Burgess had always maintained his innocence in Yolande's case. He always denied it and said that he had no contact with Yolande that night. Well, this now proved that that was a lie. His DNA being on her headband proved that he did have contact with her that evening. And the evidence against him did not stop there because scientists also discovered traces of his DNA on the hair comb that was found at the crime scene. And I believe that this comb may have belonged to Yolande, but don't quote me on that, I'm not entirely sure. Maybe it was even David's comb, but as I said, it was recovered from the crime scene, so it was more evidence to prove his whereabouts that night. And now the police finally found that they had enough evidence after all these years to prove what they had always believed, that David Burgess was the man who killed 17-year-old Yolande Waddington. And so in 2011, he was charged with her murder. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering by this point about the blood screening tests that were carried out back in 1966 when Yolande was killed. The tests that seemed to actually rule David Burgess out as being the perpetrator. So just to quickly refresh your memory, obviously back then they had found traces of the killer's blood on Yolande's beige jumper, and all they could do with this blood evidence at the time was establish which blood group it had come from. And so, as we know, they did the whole voluntary mass blood screening and asked all of the males who lived in the village of Beenham to come forward and give a blood sample so that the police could identify all of the men that had the same blood group as the murderer, and that way they could slowly narrow down their suspect list. And David Burgess was one of the many men that willingly gave his blood sample at the time. However, the results of these tests showed that apparently he didn't match. He didn't have the same blood type as Yolande's killer. So how does that make sense? How does that work? Why in 2010/2011 did his DNA come back as an exact match to the DNA found on the evidence when back in 1966 his blood group was determined not to have been the same as the killer's? Well, the police have come up with two possible explanations for this. Their first theory is that maybe the test was carried out incorrectly back in the 60s, or that his test was incorrectly labelled or something. Perhaps it was just human error. Or another theory that I came across during my research of this case was that maybe back when the mass blood screening was happening, David Burgess actually got someone else to go in and give a blood sample for him. Maybe he paid another man to pretend to be him and give his DNA in his place. I mean, that kind of thing has happened before. I don't know if you guys will remember when I covered the Colin Pitchfork case a couple of years ago, but he was a man from the UK who murdered 2 young girls back in the 1980s. And similarly, in that case, the police asked all of the local men to come forward and give a sample of their DNA so that it could be tested against the DNA of the murderer. And Colin Pitchfork, obviously knowing that he was the killer, he persuaded one of his colleagues to go and give a DNA sample for him under his name. So perhaps that is what David Burgess did, but who knows? Again, that's just a theory. Exactly what happened with that first test, how that mistake was made, we don't know. Maybe it was human error, or maybe it was an act of deception on David's part. But anyway, going back, or fast forward, I suppose, to David Burgess in 2011. So he was officially charged with Yolande's murder, and he was also re-interviewed around this time, just to see if finally, after all these years, he would confess. Of course, he didn't. And so the case against Burgess was headed to trial. His trial began in mid-2012 and it lasted for about 5 weeks in total. Burgess obviously pleaded not guilty to the charge, and during this trial he behaved in a way that was very similar to the way that he behaved back in 1967 during his trial for the murders of Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams. Like, he honestly did not have a care in the world. There was no emotion, no display of remorse or guilt. He just acted like he couldn't give a shit, which I'm sure that in itself probably spoke volumes to the jury. The prosecution presented the jury with all of the evidence that the police had obtained against him, so the forensic evidence. And actually during the trial they also had evidence in the form of a witness. A woman who lived in Beanham back in the 60s came forward and she claimed that one evening, I believe in 1963, so just a couple of years before Yolande was killed, she was followed by David Burgess while she was walking home alone after having used a phone box. He just started following her and apparently he attacked her. I'm not entirely sure in what way attacked her, whether he became violent and started hitting her or something, or whether this was a sexual attack, but regardless, she decided to tell her story during the trial, which of course really helped the prosecution's case because it was just more evidence to show how much of a danger David Burgess was to young women. When the trial came to a close, the jury was sent off to deliberate, and the deliberation process took about 5 days in total. And when they returned, they announced that they had found 64-year-old David Burgess guilty of murder by a majority verdict of 11-1, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum term of 27 years. So at the very earliest, he could come up for parole when he is in his early 90s, but of course that's if he even makes it to that age, and even if he does, it's still probably quite unlikely that he will be let out. Finally, after more than 4.5 decades, Yolande Waddington had gotten the justice that she deserved. Her family got the answers that they had been waiting for so long. Although what's so heartbreaking is that I believe it was only Yolande's younger brother Giles who was around to see justice be served. I believe her parents had tragically passed away by the time David Burgess went to trial, so they died having never seen their daughter's killer face punishment for what he did, which is just awful. But that concludes this case, the horrific case of Yolande Waddington, Jeanette Wigmore and Jacqueline Williams, also known as the Beanham murders. As always, please do let me know your thoughts and opinions on this case in the comments. I really want to hear what you guys think, and also feel free to let me know of any other cases that you would like to see me cover on this channel. They can be solved cases, unsolved cases, serial killer cases. I feel like it's been a while since I covered a serial killer case, so do let me know if you have any serial killer case suggestions. Thank you all so much for watching. Please do give this video a thumbs up and subscribe if you haven't already, and I will see you again next week for another mystery with Mollie. Bye!